You are living a life that does not belong to you. That is the uncomfortable truth most people spend their entire lives avoiding. Your personality, your ambitions, your opinions, even the way you speak sometimes. Much of it was shaped not by genuine desire, but by performance. Performance for family, performance for friends, performance for strangers online, performance for systems rewarding obedience while calling it success. And eventually the performance becomes so constant that people forget there was ever an authentic self beneath it. They stop asking, what do I actually want? And begin asking, what version of me will be accepted? That question quietly destroys millions of lives, because every time you betray your instincts for approval, you fracture your relationship with yourself slightly more, not dramatically. Subtly, a small compromise here, a fake laugh there, a watered-down opinion, a dream abandoned because it looked unrealistic, a personality adjusted to avoid rejection. At first it feels harmless, strategic even, but over time these tiny betrayals accumulate, until one day you wake up exhausted without understanding why, because performing is exhausting. Especially when the audience never stops watching. Modern life turned human beings into full-time actors. Everyone curating themselves constantly, editing thoughts before speaking, editing emotions before expressing, editing desires before pursuing them. The world no longer rewards authenticity consistently. It rewards marketability. People become brands long before they become themselves. And social media accelerated this psychological collapse beyond anything previous generations experienced. Now every moment carries invisible spectators, invisible judges, invisible algorithms calculating your social worth through attention. Likes become emotional currency. Views become validation. Approval becomes survival. And slowly people stop living internally. They begin living externally, performing existence instead of experiencing it. You can see it everywhere. People traveling only for photographs, helping others for recognition, expressing outrage for social acceptance, building personalities optimized for engagement instead of truth. Everyone selling fragments of themselves to invisible crowds, hoping to receive enough approval to feel real. That is the digital mercenary trap. You become hired labor for collective expectations. A mercenary fighting battles you never chose for rewards that never truly satisfy you. And the payment always seems valuable initially. Attention, validation, belonging, status. But hidden beneath every transaction is spiritual debt. Because external validation functions exactly like dopamine. Temporary elevation, temporary relief. Temporary emotional stimulation. Then emptiness returns stronger than before, so you seek another hit, another compliment, another notification, another sign that you matter. And eventually your nervous system becomes dependent on external reaction to maintain internal stability. That is psychological slavery disguised as social participation. A person addicted to approval cannot think freely, cannot speak freely, cannot live freely, because every decision becomes filtered through anticipated judgment. How will they react? Will this make me look foolish? Will people still accept me if I change? That fear creates invisible prisons stronger than physical walls. People abandon entire futures because of imagined criticism. Imagine how tragic that is. A human being with enormous potential, paralyzed by the opinions of people equally confused about life themselves. And the worst part is that modern society rewards this obedience. Conformity is profitable. Predictable people are easier to market to, easier to control, easier to emotionally manipulate. That is why systems constantly encourage performance over authenticity. Because authentic people are dangerous. A person deeply connected to themselves becomes difficult to pressure socially, difficult to shame, difficult to emotionally blackmail. They stop needing collective approval to justify their existence. And that kind of independence threatens every structure built on psychological dependency. This is where the Ronin enters the conversation. Historically, a Ronin was a samurai without a master, feared, uncontrolled, untethered from external ownership. But the deeper meaning matters more than the historical one. The Ronin represents the individual who refuses to sell their soul for belonging. The person willing to walk alone rather than kneel for acceptance. The person who values inner truth more than public approval. That path terrifies most people, because serving external masters provides emotional certainty. You always know what is expected, what role to play, what script to follow. Authenticity removes those scripts completely. Suddenly, every choice becomes your responsibility. Your identity becomes self-authored instead of socially inherited. And self-authorship is frightening, because it forces confrontation. What if your goals are not truly yours? What if your personality was built for survival rather than truth? What if much of your life has been unconscious imitation? These questions destabilize people deeply. Most avoid them forever, because false identity still feels safer than uncertainty. But the Ronin chooses differently. The Ronin accepts temporary loneliness over permanent self-betrayal, accepts misunderstanding over false belonging, accepts uncertainty over artificial certainty. That is not rebellion for the sake of rebellion. It is spiritual survival. Because eventually every human being faces the same decision: continue performing for others or begin becoming real. And becoming real comes with consequences. People may misunderstand you, resist your growth, call you selfish for developing boundaries, call you arrogant for no longer shrinking yourself to preserve their comfort. Because people often prefer the version of you they can control, not the version becoming autonomous. That is why authenticity feels lonely initially. Not because authenticity is wrong, because it disrupts established social contracts. When you stop performing, many relationships reveal they were built on performance too. That realization hurts deeply, but it is necessary, because false belonging slowly kills the soul. And perhaps that is why so many people feel emotionally numb now. They have spent years performing versions of themselves so consistently that genuine emotion barely reaches the surface anymore. They became strangers to themselves gradually, one compromise at a time, one performance at a time, one act at a time, until the mask fused with the face. The Ronin path begins with tearing that mask off, not publicly, internally, quietly asking yourself difficult questions. What do I truly value when nobody watches? What desires genuinely belong to me? What parts of my personality are authentic, and what parts were constructed for acceptance? Those questions change people permanently, because once you see the performance clearly, continuing it becomes unbearable. And that is where true personal mastery begins, not with motivation, not with productivity hacks, with honesty, brutal honesty, the kind capable of dismantling inherited identities entirely. Because before you can become strong, you must first stop belonging to everyone else. The digital mercenary trap. The modern world no longer needs chains to control people. It discovered something far more effective: attention. If a system can control your attention, it can slowly control your identity. And most people surrendered their attention voluntarily. Every morning begins the same way now: a glowing screen, notifications waiting, algorithms already studying your emotional state before your consciousness fully wakes up. Before you even speak to yourself internally, the world speaks first, telling you what matters, what trends, what to fear, what to desire, who to become. And people call this freedom. But what kind of freedom exists when your thoughts are constantly interrupted before they fully form? Modern social algorithms are not neutral tools. They are psychological environments engineered to shape behavior. Every swipe trains preference. Every notification conditions reaction. Every like reinforces performance. The system studies human insecurity with terrifying precision, not to heal it, to monetize it. That is why social platforms reward emotional exaggeration over truth, certainty over nuance, performance over authenticity. The more predictable your reactions become, the more valuable you become economically. People think they are expressing themselves online. Often they are simply responding to invisible conditioning loops designed to maximize engagement. And engagement requires emotional dependency. That is the core mechanism. If platforms can make your self-worth dependent on reaction, you will return endlessly, seeking another emotional hit, another sign that you matter, another small burst of validation to quiet the growing emptiness underneath. This is where the mercenary metaphor becomes painfully accurate, because mercenaries do not fight for meaning. They fight for payment. And modern people increasingly trade pieces of their identity for social rewards. Approval, attention, visibility, belonging, but the payment is temporary, always temporary. That is why external validation creates addiction so easily. A compliment feels powerful briefly, then disappears. A viral post feels meaningful briefly, then fades. Recognition satisfies for a moment, then the nervous system demands more. And eventually people stop asking whether they even enjoy what they are doing. They only ask whether people are reacting to it. That is spiritual erosion happening in real time. The self becomes outsourced to public opinion. Imagine the psychological consequences of this long term. A generation unable to distinguish genuine desire from socially rewarded behavior. People choosing careers for prestige rather than meaning. Opinions for applause rather than conviction. Relationships for appearance rather than connection. Entire identities shaped around marketability. Everyone becoming their own public relations manager. Even suffering became performative now. People no longer experience emotions privately. Everything becomes content. Grief uploaded. Loneliness aestheticized. Healing packaged into captions. Human experience transformed into consumable material for invisible audiences. And the constant performance creates exhaustion beyond physical fatigue. Because performing identity requires continuous self-surveillance. You begin monitoring yourself constantly. How do I appear? How am I perceived? Will this make me look successful, interesting, attractive, acceptable? That internal monitoring fractures presence completely. You stop inhabiting moments naturally. You observe yourself living instead. That is why many people feel disconnected from their own lives now. They are no longer participants. They are performers documenting existence from outside themselves. And the nervous system was never designed for this level of continuous social exposure. For most of human history, people lived within small tribes, limited observation, limited comparison. Now, the average person compares themselves against millions daily, millions of bodies, millions of careers, millions of lifestyles, millions of edited identities pretending to represent reality. No human psychology evolved for this. And slowly comparison mutates into self-rejection. People start viewing themselves through algorithmic standards instead of human ones. Too slow, too ugly, too unsuccessful, too ordinary, too behind. The machine always creates inadequacy because inadequacy keeps people consuming. A fulfilled person is difficult to manipulate commercially, but an insecure person, endlessly profitable. So modern systems quietly encourage emotional instability while pretending to promote empowerment. And people rarely notice because the manipulation feels pleasurable initially. That is what makes it dangerous. Nobody willingly enters psychological slavery. They enter through comfort, entertainment, belonging. Tiny rewards repeated thousands of times until dependency forms. The digital mercenary trap does not imprison people through force. It seduces them through stimulation. And eventually many people forget what unperformed existence even feels like. Silence becomes uncomfortable because silence removes validation. Being alone feels unbearable because there is no audience confirming identity. People become terrified of disappearing socially, terrified of irrelevance, terrified of anonymity. But the Ronin understands something modern society forgot completely. A person obsessed with being seen can never fully see themselves. That sentence changes everything, because authentic self-knowledge requires distance from performance, distance from constant reaction, distance from collective noise. The Ronin refuses to auction identity publicly for emotional scraps, refuses to shape behavior around algorithmic approval, refuses to become psychologically programmable. That refusal is revolutionary now, because modern culture conditions people to seek masters everywhere. Corporate masters, social masters, ideological masters, algorithmic masters, everyone serving something, everyone adjusting themselves for acceptance within systems they never consciously chose. And the systems reward obedience carefully, not freedom. Obedience disguised as individuality. You can wear different aesthetics, different political labels, different lifestyles, but as long as your nervous system still depends on collective validation, you remain controlled. That is why true autonomy begins internally, not externally. A person can quit social media and still remain psychologically enslaved to approval. The deeper question is this: can you tolerate disapproval without collapsing emotionally? Can you exist without needing constant external confirmation? Can you pursue truth even when it costs social comfort? Most people cannot. Not because they are weak, because dependency was trained into them gradually. Since childhood, good grades for approval, good behavior for approval, success for approval, conformity for approval. The pattern begins early. And by adulthood, many people no longer know where their authentic self ends and social conditioning begins. That is why the Ronin path feels so unsettling. It dismantles inherited dependency, forces confrontation with the terrifying possibility that much of your personality may have been constructed for survival rather than truth. And dismantling false identity hurts, because performance often protected you, protected belonging, protected safety, protected acceptance. But eventually the cost becomes unbearable. The soul grows tired of negotiating itself constantly, tired of shrinking, tired of pretending, tired of seeking permission to exist authentically. That exhaustion becomes the beginning of awakening. The moment a person realizes, I cannot continue living as emotional labor for other people's expectations. That realization creates separation, not hatred towards society, clarity about it. The Ronin does not withdraw because he despises humanity. He withdraws because he refuses ownership, refuses to let external systems dictate internal reality. And from that detachment, something rare begins forming, an individual capable of thinking independently, acting independently, existing independently, not isolated emotionally, free psychologically. That kind of freedom is becoming increasingly rare, and precisely because it is rare, it has become priceless. Severing the invisible leashes. Most people believe slavery disappeared long ago, but slavery simply evolved psychologically. Modern chains are invisible, which makes them far more difficult to recognize. No one forces you physically anymore. Instead, they shape what you fear losing: approval, status, belonging, reputation. And once a person becomes emotionally dependent on these things, control becomes effortless, because human beings will betray themselves repeatedly to avoid social exile. That is the first truth the Ronin understands. Most people are not living freely. They are negotiating their existence constantly with invisible masters. Some serve family expectations, living lives inherited instead of chosen, becoming doctors, lawyers, corporate machines, not because desire exists there, but because disappointing parents feels unbearable. Others serve professional archetypes, performing competence constantly, suppressing emotion, suppressing exhaustion, suppressing individuality to survive within systems rewarding obedience over authenticity. Some serve peer groups, changing language, beliefs, behavior, humor, even morality depending on the audience surrounding them. And many serve ideology itself, political tribes, social movements, internet cultures, entire identities outsourced to collective narratives because independent thinking feels lonely. Everyone serving something. Everyone adjusting themselves slightly for acceptance. At first, these adjustments appear harmless. Human beings naturally adapt socially. That is normal. But there is a dangerous threshold where adaptation becomes self-erasure, where the personality no longer bends temporarily. It remains bent permanently. That is where invisible leashes form. And invisible leashes are terrifying because they feel voluntary. Nobody notices the control immediately. You simply stop saying certain thoughts. Stop pursuing certain desires. Stop expressing certain parts of yourself because maintaining approval becomes more important than maintaining honesty. And eventually the suppression becomes automatic. You censor yourself before the world even asks you to. That is advanced conditioning. The prison installs itself internally. You can feel this happening everywhere now. People terrified to disappoint anyone, terrified to be misunderstood, terrified to say no, terrified to choose paths that do not make sense socially. So they remain trapped inside emotionally negotiated lives. Lives optimized for acceptance rather than truth. But truth always demands sacrifice eventually. That is unavoidable. The moment you begin reclaiming yourself honestly, disappointment enters the room. People will resist your boundaries, resist your evolution, resist your detachment from roles that once benefited them emotionally. Because many relationships are built unconsciously around mutual performance. You play your role, they play theirs. Everyone remains comfortable. But once one person changes, the entire structure destabilizes. This is why authenticity often feels disruptive, not because authenticity is cruel, because systems built on expectation cannot tolerate unpredictability easily. The Ronin accepts this cost consciously, accepts misunderstanding, accepts temporary isolation, accepts becoming the villain inside certain people's narratives, not out of arrogance, out of necessity, because reclaiming your life requires the courage to disappoint others. That sentence alone terrifies most people. They would rather abandon themselves completely than risk disapproval. And society quietly rewards this self-abandonment. People call it maturity, responsibility, being realistic. But often it is fear wearing sophisticated clothing, fear of rejection, fear of standing alone, fear of becoming psychologically independent. Yet no authentic life emerges without confrontation. You cannot belong entirely to yourself while simultaneously belonging entirely to collective expectations. At some point, a decision must be made. Who owns your mind? Who owns your time? Who owns your future? Most people never ask these questions seriously. They inherit scripts and follow them automatically. School, career, marriage, consumption, retirement, a socially approved sequence repeated so consistently that questioning it feels dangerous. But the Ronin questions everything, not cynically, consciously, because unconscious living slowly destroys the spirit. You can feel it in people sometimes, that strange emotional deadness. The exhaustion behind polite smiles, the quiet grief of individuals living lives that no longer belong to them internally. Many people are successful externally while spiritually absent from their own existence. That absence begins with invisible compromise, tiny betrayals repeated daily, saying yes when you mean no, choosing comfort over truth repeatedly, waiting for permission before making decisions, looking outward constantly for approval before acting. This dependency weakens instinct over time. People stop trusting themselves. Stop listening to internal signals. Eventually, they cannot distinguish genuine desire from social conditioning anymore. That is why radical detachment becomes necessary. Not total isolation from humanity. Detachment from ownership, from emotional servitude, from compulsive approval seeking. And detachment begins practically. Small acts first. Saying no without over-explaining. Making decisions without consulting everyone. Allowing silence instead of defending yourself constantly. Refusing invitations that drain you. Pursuing interests others do not understand. Protecting your attention aggressively. These actions appear minor externally, but psychologically they are revolutionary, because each act strengthens internal authority. The nervous system slowly learns, I can survive disapproval. That realization changes people profoundly, especially those conditioned since childhood to equate approval with safety. At first, detachment feels terrifying. Guilt appears immediately. Anxiety appears immediately. You will feel selfish, cold, arrogant. That is conditioning fighting for survival. Because systems benefiting from your compliance rarely celebrate your independence. People accustomed to your self-sacrifice may resent your boundaries. People benefiting from your emotional availability may interpret your withdrawal personally. That is part of the process. The Ronin understands an important truth. Not everyone deserves unlimited access to your energy. Modern culture treats self-sacrifice like virtue constantly. But endless self-sacrifice without reciprocity becomes self-destruction eventually. You cannot build authentic character while continuously betraying your instincts to maintain comfort for others. At some point, you must choose discomfort consciously. The discomfort of honesty, the discomfort of boundaries, the discomfort of uncertainty, the discomfort of standing alone temporarily, because temporary loneliness heals faster than lifelong self-betrayal. And slowly, through this detachment, something extraordinary begins happening internally. Clarity returns, not instantly, gradually. You begin hearing your own thoughts again beneath collective noise. Your preferences become clearer. Your instincts sharpen. Your emotional reactions stop revolving around external validation constantly. That is the beginning of autonomy. Real autonomy, not rebellious aesthetics, not performative independence. Internal independence. The ability to make decisions aligned with truth even when applause disappears. And this requires unilateral decision-making. A skill modern people rarely develop. Most individuals outsource decisions constantly. To trends, to crowds, to family, to online consensus. The Ronin reverses this completely. He studies deeply, reflects carefully, then decides independently, and accepts responsibility afterward without needing endless reassurance. That is maturity, not certainty. Responsibility. The willingness to own your path completely even when outcomes remain unclear. Because freedom without responsibility becomes chaos. But responsibility without freedom becomes imprisonment. The Ronin seeks balance between both. A life directed internally rather than externally managed. A life no longer controlled by invisible leashes disguised as love, duty, status, or belonging. And perhaps the deepest shift happens here. You stop asking permission to exist as yourself. You stop negotiating your authenticity constantly. You stop shrinking to preserve comfort for others. And in that moment, the chains begin falling quietly from the mind. The forge of strategic isolation. Most people fear being alone more than they fear becoming fake. That is why they remain surrounded constantly. Constant conversations, constant noise, constant digital presence. Anything to avoid sitting quietly with themselves long enough to hear what exists beneath the performance. Because silence is dangerous. Silence removes distractions. And once distractions disappear, the real questions begin surfacing. Who am I when nobody watches? What do I actually enjoy? What beliefs genuinely belong to me? What parts of my personality were constructed for survival? These questions destabilize people deeply. That is why loneliness terrifies modern society. Not because solitude is inherently painful, because solitude exposes unresolved identity. And systems built on performance cannot survive prolonged self-confrontation. So people stay busy endlessly, scrolling, talking, posting, consuming, performing. The mind becomes overcrowded intentionally because inner stillness threatens the entire illusion. But the Ronin understands something most people never discover. Isolation is not punishment. Isolation is refinement. A forge, a psychological training ground where identity is separated from performance slowly through silence and observation. That is why strategic isolation matters. Not isolation born from bitterness, not emotional withdrawal fueled by resentment. Intentional solitude, chosen space between yourself and collective noise, long enough to rediscover your authentic internal rhythm. And that process feels uncomfortable initially, painfully uncomfortable, because the first thing solitude reveals is how dependent many people are on external stimulation. Without constant input, anxiety rises. Restlessness rises. The nervous system begins craving distraction immediately. People reach for phones automatically, music automatically, conversation automatically, anything to avoid direct contact with themselves. But eventually, if you remain inside the silence long enough, something changes. The noise settles, and beneath the noise, you begin hearing yourself again, not the performed self. The quieter self underneath, the one buried beneath years of social conditioning. That voice often arrives softly at first, through boredom, through forgotten interests resurfacing unexpectedly, through realizations that certain goals were never truly yours. The quiet period is essential because performance thrives in crowded environments. When constantly observed, human beings instinctively adapt behavior, even subconsciously. But solitude removes the audience entirely. And without an audience, performance loses purpose. That is where authentic character begins forming. Not publicly, privately. Modern culture misunderstands loneliness completely. It treats being alone like failure, as if social visibility equals emotional health automatically. But many socially connected people feel profoundly disconnected from themselves internally. Meanwhile, some isolated individuals are building extraordinary depth quietly. Because depth requires uninterrupted reflection, and reflection requires silence. The Ronin enters isolation not to escape humanity, but to recover clarity before re-entering humanity consciously. That distinction matters. Strategic isolation is not about hating people. It is about auditing influence, examining which desires belong to you and which were inherited socially. Most people never perform this audit honestly. They simply absorb identities unconsciously from their environment. Music tastes, political beliefs, career ambitions, relationship standards, entire personalities downloaded from collective culture without examination. That is why so many people feel emotionally fragmented now. Their inner world contains conflicting desires gathered from incompatible sources. Part of them seeks freedom. Part seeks approval. Part seeks peace. Part seeks attention. The personality becomes crowded with borrowed expectations. Strategic isolation clears this psychological clutter slowly, not instantly. Slowly, at first you may feel empty, aimless, disoriented, because once performance disappears, many people realize they do not actually know themselves deeply. That realization can feel devastating, but it is also the beginning of truth. Most people skip this stage entirely. They rush back into distraction immediately because uncertainty feels unbearable. But the Ronin stays long enough to observe honestly. Which interests energize me naturally? What activities feel meaningful without external recognition? What kind of life would I pursue if nobody applauded it? These questions rebuild identity from the inside outward. An identity built internally possesses enormous stability, because externally constructed identities collapse whenever validation disappears. But internally forged character remains grounded even during rejection, criticism, or isolation. This is why solitude creates a certain aura around people who have endured it consciously. Groundedness, calmness, emotional independence, not arrogance, presence. They no longer chase attention desperately because they already developed companionship with themselves. That changes social dynamics completely. Manipulation becomes difficult when a person is no longer terrified of losing approval. Emotional blackmail loses power. Social pressure weakens, because the deepest fear underlying conformity is abandonment. Once a person becomes comfortable alone, collective control begins losing effectiveness. That is why strategic isolation creates strength modern society rarely understands. Not loud strength, quiet strength. The ability to remain emotionally stable without constant external reassurance. And this strength transforms relationships too. Ironically, people capable of solitude often form healthier connections, eventually, because they no longer approach relationships from desperation. They no longer need others to complete fractured identities. They choose connection consciously instead of clinging to it fearfully. That difference changes everything. Desperate people tolerate manipulation. Lonely people tolerate disrespect. But grounded individuals can walk away when necessary because they already proved to themselves they can survive alone. That survival creates freedom, real freedom, the freedom to love without dependency, to connect without surrendering identity, to participate socially without becoming psychologically owned. And yet the quiet period remains painful. There will be moments where isolation feels unbearable, moments where silence amplifies old wounds, moments where the absence of distraction reveals grief you avoided for years. That is part of the forge too, because unresolved pain often hides beneath performance. People stay busy partly to avoid emotional confrontation, but healing requires exposure eventually. The Ronin faces this willingly. Not because suffering is romantic, because avoidance prolongs weakness indefinitely. And slowly, through repeated solitude, emotional endurance develops. You stop fearing your own mind, stop needing constant stimulation, stop panicking inside silence. The nervous system stabilizes, thoughts become clearer, desires become simpler, life becomes less performative. That simplicity creates unusual power, especially now, because modern humanity is psychologically exhausted from overexposure. Too much noise, too much comparison, too much performance. People barely know what they genuinely feel anymore. So when someone enters a room fully grounded in themselves, others notice immediately. Not because of dominance, because authenticity radiates differently. There is less desperation, less performance, less invisible hunger for approval. And this groundedness cannot be faked convincingly. It must be built privately. Inside solitude, inside silence, inside the uncomfortable process of meeting yourself honestly without distraction. That is the forge, and every moment spent there reshapes character permanently. Because eventually you realize something powerful: loneliness was never the real enemy. Abandoning yourself was. Living as a modern Ronin. Eventually the isolation ends. The forge cools. The noise no longer controls you the same way. And then comes the final challenge, returning to the world without becoming owned by it again. Because the goal was never permanent withdrawal. The goal was transformation. To leave as a socially conditioned person and return as someone internally sovereign. That is the difference between isolation and exile. Exile escapes life. The Ronin re-enters it consciously. And this stage matters deeply because many people mistake awakening for separation. They detach from society emotionally, become cynical, cold, disconnected, But bitterness is not freedom. Bitterness is unresolved attachment wearing darker clothing. The modern Ronin does not hate humanity. He simply refuses unconscious participation. Refuses to become psychologically absorbed by systems demanding performance over truth. So he walks differently now. Not loudly, not arrogantly, deliberately. Every decision becomes intentional. Who deserves access to his energy? What conversations deserve attention? What environments weaken clarity? What habits slowly corrupt discipline? He no longer drifts automatically through life. And that intentionality creates presence. A groundedness most people feel immediately, even if they cannot explain it. Because modern people are exhausted from fragmentation, exhausted from endless performance. So when they encounter someone deeply aligned internally, it feels rare, almost unsettling. The modern Ronin does not seek approval desperately anymore, which changes social dynamics completely. Most human interaction is subtle negotiation, people adjusting themselves constantly for acceptance. But someone internally sovereign creates a different atmosphere, less chasing, less performing, less invisible hunger. And paradoxically, this often draws people closer naturally, because authenticity possesses gravitational force. Not curated authenticity, real authenticity, the kind built through confrontation, solitude, discipline, and painful honesty. Still, the Ronin remains careful, because re-entering society after reclaiming yourself creates temptation. Old patterns wait patiently. Validation addiction, performance habits, fear of rejection, the desire to belong at any cost. These instincts do not disappear permanently. They must be managed consciously. That is why the modern Ronin builds boundaries carefully, not walls. Walls isolate, boundaries protect. There is a difference. He learns how to participate without surrendering identity, to connect without dissolving into collective expectations, to love people deeply without becoming emotionally owned by them. That balance is difficult, especially because society rewards self-sacrifice constantly. People expect access now, constant availability, constant emotional labor, constant responsiveness. But the Ronin understands that energy is finite, attention is finite, life itself is finite. So he stops giving himself away carelessly, not from selfishness, from awareness, because every unnecessary obligation steals time from your actual mission. And mission becomes central now. That is the final transformation. Life stops feeling random, stops revolving around external milestones entirely. The modern Ronin no longer measures existence through social metrics. Not followers, not titles, not status, not comparison. Those things become secondary at best. Instead, he begins asking different questions. Did I live honestly today? Did I maintain discipline today? Did I protect my mind from corruption today? Did I move closer to mastery today? Those questions create internal direction independent of public opinion. That independence changes everything psychologically, because externally driven people remain emotionally unstable. Praise elevates them, criticism destroys them, trends confuse them, comparison poisons them. But internally directed people remain steadier, not emotionless. Grounded, their center exists inside principles rather than reactions. That center becomes crucial in the modern world, because the future will pressure people aggressively. More distraction, more ideological conflict, more psychological manipulation, more systems competing for human attention and obedience. Most people will drift wherever the pressure pushes them. The modern Ronin resists drift consciously, not through aggression, through clarity. Clarity about values, clarity about priorities, clarity about what deserves devotion and what merely demands performance. That clarity protects the mind, and perhaps most importantly, it transforms relationships completely. The modern Ronin no longer seeks connection to fill internal emptiness. He approaches relationships from wholeness instead of desperation. That creates depth impossible for dependent people to sustain, because dependent love always carries fear beneath it. Fear of abandonment, fear of loneliness, fear of losing identity. But grounded people love differently, freely, without possession, without manipulation, without shrinking themselves for approval. And this creates authentic intimacy, the kind impossible to perform, the kind built through honesty instead of need. Ironically, the person who becomes comfortable alone often becomes capable of deeper connection than everyone constantly chasing attention, because they no longer need people to rescue them from themselves. That changes the entire emotional atmosphere. And yes, there will still be loneliness sometimes. Moments where walking your own path feels isolating. Moments where misunderstanding hurts. Moments where society pressures you back toward conformity. That never disappears completely. But now the loneliness feels cleaner, purposeful. Not the loneliness of self-abandonment, the loneliness of integrity. And integrity creates peace impossible to purchase socially. A quiet peace. The peace of no longer performing constantly, no longer negotiating your existence for approval, no longer betraying your instincts daily to maintain belonging. That peace is priceless, especially in an age where identity itself became commercialized. The modern Ronin becomes difficult to manipulate precisely because he no longer needs the world to constantly confirm his worth. He already built that worth privately. Inside discipline, inside solitude, inside self-respect earned slowly through alignment between action and truth. That alignment becomes armor, not against pain, against fragmentation, because fragmented people are easy to control, but integrated people become sovereign. And sovereignty changes the way you move through reality itself. You stop rushing, stop panicking, stop shape-shifting for every audience. You become selective, intentional, difficult to emotionally capture, not cold, centered. The modern Ronin understands something most people never fully realize. Freedom is not doing whatever you want impulsively. Freedom is no longer needing permission to become who you truly are. That is the final liberation, not external rebellion, internal ownership. Ownership of your attention, your values, your decisions, your identity, your life. And once someone experiences that level of inner autonomy, returning to unconscious performance becomes impossible. Because now they have seen the truth clearly. Most people are not exhausted from life itself. They are exhausted from pretending to be someone else for too long. The Ronin ends that performance permanently, and in doing so finally begins living. And if this message unsettled something inside you, good, because maybe part of you is finally getting tired of performing, tired of shrinking yourself for approval, tired of negotiating your identity just to remain acceptable to people who abandoned their own authenticity long ago. Most people will spend their entire lives acting successful, acting confident, acting fulfilled, acting like the noise around them has not completely disconnected them from themselves. But deep down they know they are exhausted, not from life itself, from performance, from constantly managing perception instead of building character. And maybe you felt that exhaustion while listening to this. Maybe some part of you recognized how many decisions in your life were shaped by fear of rejection rather than truth. That realization hurts, but it also liberates, because once you see the invisible leashes, you can finally begin cutting them. Slowly, quietly, one boundary at a time, one honest decision at a time, one act of self-respect at a time. The world does not need more perfectly curated personalities. It needs more people willing to become real again. People willing to think independently, stand independently, build independently. People willing to protect their minds in a culture profiting from distraction and dependency. That path will feel lonely sometimes. But there is a different kind of loneliness waiting on the other side of conformity too. the loneliness of realizing you abandoned yourself just to stay accepted, and that loneliness is far heavier. So if these ideas resonated with you, if some part of you knows you were meant for deeper discipline, deeper clarity, deeper self-mastery, then subscribe to the channel. Not for empty motivation, for reminders. Reminders to return to yourself before the world turns you into another obedient performance. And share this video with the people you care about, the ones quietly struggling beneath social pressure, the ones exhausted from pretending, the ones trying to become stronger internally while the modern world keeps pulling them toward distraction. Because maybe the rarest thing in this era is not intelligence, not talent, not success. Maybe the rarest thing is a human being who still belongs completely to themselves.